You just have to flip the button on, and it's real loud. So I can adjust it if you need me to. Do you want to? Yeah. Do you want to test that and see if it's too loud, and if I need to turn it down?
Hello? Is that too loud? Okay. I won't put it directly in front of my mouth for fear of hurting people's ears. Ready? Okay. Well, thanks for coming, everyone. My name is Meredith Horsford. I'm the Executive Director of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum, just up the block. So just to kind of kick off the conversation, just wanted to tell you a little bit about kind of what we've been doing and how we've arrived where we are now and where we plan to go. So at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum, we've been working on changing our narrative. The narrative that we tell at the museum to make sure that it is more inclusive, which is an important step for us. The first step in that process was working with local and state elected officials to bring awareness to, and hopefully at some point, a memorial plaque for the site of the Inwood slave burial ground, which is present-day 212th Street. Our next step was partnering with local artist Peter Hoffmeister, who's sitting right here in the front, and curator Gabriel de Guzman on Peter's site-specific exhibition, Ground Revision, which is on display throughout the museum. His exhibit was inspired by the slaves past of the Dyckmans and the slave burial ground on 212th Street. So afterward, we're going to go take a look at the exhibit if everyone's still got a few minutes, and you can have an opportunity to chat with the artist. Very exclusive. The next step was that we received a grant from the New York Community Trust, which allowed the museum to hire a research assistant, Alex Lerner, who's right over here on the panel, to uncover as much information as we can about the enslaved on the Dyckman property, as well as what it was like for the enslaved in what we now know as Upper Manhattan. You will hear from Alex in a few minutes, but I also wanted to add that once Alex's research concludes, we will be infusing that information into the stories that we tell at the museums, into our public programs, and also into the way the interior of the farmhouse looks. In addition to the New York Community Trust, we would also like to thank Humanities New York, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, and the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone for their support of this project, as well as, of course, as the library for hosting us today. Today you'll be hearing from our panel moderator and two panelists, and then afterward, as I mentioned, we invite everyone back to the museum to view Peter's exhibit and ask questions and continue the conversation. So first, I would like to introduce our moderator, Gretchen Soren, Distinguished Professor at SUNY Oneonta's Cooperstown Graduate Program, historian, and author of the upcoming book, Driving While Black, African American Travel and the Road to Civil Rights.
I'm going to stand up. I'm used to teaching this way, so I'd like to stand up. I want to get you all thinking about what New York State was like in the 18th century. And in order to do that, I brought a description from 1760 that came from the Reverend Andrew Burnaby, who traveled from England to New York. And he writes about what New York was like. So I want to kind of get you in the mindset of 18th century New York. He says, "This city is situated upon the point of a small island lying open to the bay on one side, and on the others included between the North and East rivers, and commands a fine prospect of water, the Jerseys, Long Island, Staten Island, and several others which lie scattered in the bay. It contains between 2,000 and 3,000 houses." That was it. 16 or 17,000 inhabitants, is tolerably well built and has several good houses. So you can imagine there were only maybe 17,000 inhabitants at the time. The streets are paved and very clean, but in general, they are narrow. There are 2 or 3 indeed which are spacious and airy, particularly the Broad Way. The houses in this street have most of them a row of trees before them, which form an agreeable shade and produce a pretty effect. The whole length of the town is something more than 1 mile. So if you can imagine, the developed area of New York from the tip of Manhattan was 1 mile up. Everything above that is the country. Everything, so this area is very far from the developed area of New York. The whole length of the town is 1 mile. The situation is, I believe, esteemed healthy, but it is subject to one great inconvenience, which is the want of fresh water. So the inhabitants are obliged to have it brought from springs at some distance out of town. So all of the water had to be brought from springs from out of town. Think about, who was bringing that water? There are several public buildings, though but few that deserve attention, which is funny. The college, when finished, will be exceedingly handsome. It is to be built on 3 sides of a quadrangle fronting Hudson's or North River, and will be the most beautifully situated of any college, I believe, in the world. At present, only 1 wing is finished. I'll skip a little bit. They are obliged to make use of some of the apartments as a master's lodge, library, chapel, hall, etc. But as soon as the whole shall be completed, there will be proper apartments for each of these offices. The name of the college is King's College. So that was the only college. It was just being built. This is 1760. Manhattan is about 1 mile by a half a mile in size, and there are 17,000 residents. And above that, everything is, you're out in the country. You're out in the countryside. It's farm area. It's totally agricultural. There are pigs, there are chickens, there are apple trees, there are peach trees, there are cherry trees, and a lot of the food that was being grown there was supporting the city. So most people think, and a lot of people think, I know nobody in this room, but a lot of people think that slavery was in the South, that it was a totally Southern institution. But slavery in New Netherlands begins in 1626 when the Dutch West India Company brings 11 enslaved male Africans to these shores. New York, or New Amsterdam at the time, needed workers. Think about the jobs that you had to do to live in New York at that time. You had to move all the water, right? You had to bring in all the water. You had to carry all the wood. You had to cut all the wood. You had to build the buildings. It was a very undeveloped place. So the Dutch West India Company, the first thing they tried to do was to bring in Dutch workers from Holland. But what they found was that the Dutch workers didn't want to stay here. This was a really wild place. This was an undeveloped land. And what they wanted to do was come here, get involved in the fur trade, make their fortune, and go right back to Holland. So that wasn't working at all. Instead, they found that they could bring enslaved Africans here and use those people to clear the forests, right? Lay the roads, build the houses and the public buildings, and of course, grow the food. So all of these things that were required to build this city were done by enslaved people. And so we could argue that enslaved people provided the foundation on which modern New York City was built. And the involvement of enslaved people in Africa and in agriculture fed the city and made agriculture flourish, so that later on, white immigrants were willing to abandon the fur trade and go into agriculture. So that was a very important thing. So you can, if you just imagine what New York City must have been like in 1760, we know why people brought slaves to the New World. Now, museums have been a little bit remiss in their interpretation. Museums have traditionally talked about the beautiful houses, the beautiful gardens, but they've kind of neglected talking about how those houses got to be built, how those houses were cleaned, how those houses were cared for, and who carried the water, who cooked the food, who did all of the work that supported all of these houses. It's something that museums are starting to do. It's been in the news. Monticello is doing it, Mount Vernon is doing it, and the Dyckman Farmhouse is doing it. And this is a really amazing project that the Dyckman Farmhouse is embarking on, and I think it's going to result in some really, really interesting findings about what life was like in Upper Manhattan. We know what life was like in Lower Manhattan. We have a lot of people who are writing about it, who are telling historians about it. We don't know as much about what was going on in what was called Kingsbridge, which is the Inwood area. So I think we're going to find out a lot about that, and one of the people that's going to help us learn about that is Alex Lerner, who is a freelance historian, who is now the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum's history research assistant, working on a grant, as Meredith told you, from the New York Community Trust to delve deeply into the history of enslaved people in Upper Manhattan, and also more specifically, on the enslaved workers who worked at the Dyckman Farmhouse. We also have with us Levada Nahan, who is a culinary historian, and which I find fascinating. I've heard a lot about Levada, and I'm excited about hearing what she's got to say. She creates interactive programming on American foodways and on African American culture, and she has done other projects for the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. So these are our two speakers, and I will now turn the microphone over to them.
Hi. I want to begin by telling you a little bit about a slave named Isabella Vondre. She was born in the late 1790s. She had about 9 or 10 siblings, although many of them were sold off before she was born, before she had a chance to meet them. At 9 years old, Isabella herself was sold away from her parents and her remaining siblings at an auction with a flock of sheep for $100. Her new owner was harsh and violent. Isabella only spoke Dutch, but her new owner only spoke English, leading, as you can imagine, to a lot of misunderstandings and miscommunications. That led to a lot of whippings. Over the next 2 years, Isabella was sold 2 more times. Eventually, in 1815, she fell in love with a slave at a neighboring farm. His name was Robert. But Robert's owner prohibited the relationship, because by this point, slavery was a legal status inherited from a mother to her children, which meant that any children that Robert and Isabella had would belong to Isabella's owners and not Robert's. They still tried to see each other until one night when Robert snuck off his farm to visit Isabella. His master saw this, followed him, beat him savagely, and dragged him away. Isabella never saw him again. Now, on the one hand, this narrative is familiar. Slavery was an economic system that had devastating consequences for Black family life. But what might surprise you is that this didn't happen on a southern plantation. Isabella was a slave in Ulster County, New York, just north of New York City. We often think of New York as being at the center of the abolitionist struggle to end slavery. But what we don't know, and often don't think about, is that New York City actually had more slaves than any other colonial city except for Charleston, South Carolina. Slaves were also heavily concentrated along the Hudson River Valley, through Long Island, up through Albany, and throughout Westchester County. From the very beginning of Dutch settlement, through British occupation in 1664, until the emancipation of slaves in New York, all the way in 1827, New York was a state that relied on slave labor and that thrived on slave labor. The Port of New York was a major international center for slaves and for slave-produced commodities. The Wall Street slave market held auctions at least once a week. How many slaves were there? from the beginning of the 18th century until the American Revolution, the British imported nearly 7,000 slaves into New York alone. As early as the 1730s, 1 in every 5 New Yorkers was enslaved. William Stone, a European soldier traveling throughout New York during the American Revolution, left a travelogue in which he noted that every farm he saw had at least a couple of slaves. Slaves, he wrote, along with other cattle, are very prolific here. Colonial New York, as Gretchen noted, was originally called New Amsterdam, and it was settled under the Dutch. In Dutch New York, slavery was not just happenstance. Rather, it was part of the very vision of settlement. The Dutch actually recruited Europeans to the colony by promising that the Dutch West India Company would provide them with slaves. These slaves, they promised, would accomplish much more work for their masters at less expense than farm servants. For those of you who have a handout, if you turn to the first image, this was a woodcut in the 1640s that the Dutch used to help recruit Europeans. And so you can see it's called New Amsterdam, and in the foreground we have what looks to be a Dutch couple. We can probably assume this was a husband and wife to promote white family life. The man is pointing to his wife, and in one hand he's holding what are probably tobacco leaves. His wife is holding farm-produced vegetables. In the back we can see ships in the beginning of a settlement, and right in the center, below the ridge, are 4 African slaves. 2 of them are holding bundles. They are literally doing the work of settlement. In other words, from the very beginning, slaves were integral to the colony. They were used to clear land, to plant and harvest crops, to build houses, roads, bridges, fortifications. They had to cook and clean and care for children and make clothing. Like slavery in the South, and like slavery under what eventually became British New York, slavery under the Dutch was an economic system that generated enormous wealth at the expense of people denied basic human rights. Slave traders and slave owners made enormous profits from the sale of human beings and slave-produced commodities. In other words, Dutch slavery was slavery. It was in no way more gentle or easier than British slavery or what eventually became American slavery. However, it was more malleable. Slaves in New Netherland were able to own some material goods. They were at times able to petition the courts to settle disputes, and they were able to congregate together. But we should remember that these allowances in no way mitigated the fundamental fact of slavery, which was lifelong, involuntary servitude and ultimately a lack of control over one's own life and over the lives of one's family members. Slavery in New York, it flourished under Dutch rule, but it didn't become fully formalized until the British took over and codified the law. Like the Dutch, the British from the very beginning were committed to slavery. Many of those who invested in the colony of New York were actually stockholders in the Royal African Company, which had the exclusive privilege of providing slaves to Britain's New World colonies. From the 1680s until the American Revolution, the British passed a series of laws that solidified and formalized slavery in New York. I'm going to read a few of these to you so you can get a sense. In the early 1680s, slaves could not leave their house without permission. Slaves could not own weapons. Slaves could not gather in groups of more than 4 people. They could not buy alcohol or trade with whites or other free blacks. 1702. Slaves who gathered in groups of more than 3 people would be whipped 40 times. Masters could punish their slaves for any infraction, however they chose, short of killing them or cutting off their limbs. 1706. Children born to enslaved women are slaves for life. 1708. Any slave who murdered his master or conspired to murder his master would first be tortured and then killed. 1712. Any slave who conspired to revolt would be tortured and killed. 1713. No slave older than 14 could be out at night without a lantern. Funerals for slaves and free blacks had to be held during the day. 1731. No more than 12 slaves could assemble for a funeral. Like the solidification of slave law in the South, slave law in New York increasingly restricted what slaves could do and revealed white fears of slave rebellion. Slavery and racism contributed to a widespread fear of uprisings. Rumors of rebellion led to witch hunts. Slaves who were convicted of conspiring to rebel were tortured and executed. Infractions of the slave code were severely punished. In both the North and the South, slaves were dispersed according to white labor needs, and that in fact created some significant differences between slavery in New York versus slavery in the southern regions. The average New York master owned only 2 or 3 slaves. So whereas slaves on large plantations in the South lived in separate slave quarters, which at least afforded room and independence to create black family life, New York slaves were often haphazardly housed in their master's home, either in a small space in the attic, or in the cellar, or on the kitchen floor, or in a small outbuilding. Isabella Vondre, the slave we initially discussed, she recalled living in the cellar of her master's home with the rest of her master's slaves. As she described it, they slept on damp floorboards, and the only lighting consisted of a few panes of glass. But if slaves in New York lacked separate quarters, they did have different hours. They woke up earlier than anyone else, and they stayed up later. And if you look at the second handout, this is a short description I'm going to read. This is from a slave named John Jaya, who was a slave. He was captured in Africa when he was 2 years old and wound up in New York in the 1780s. This is how he described the labor. Our labor was extremely hard, being obliged to work in the summer from about 2 o'clock in the morning till 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and in the winter from 4 in the morning till 10 at night. The horses usually rested about 5 hours in the day while we were at work. Thus did the beasts enjoy greater privileges than we did. We dare not murmur, for if we did, we were corrected with a weapon an inch and a half thick, and that without mercy, striking us in the most tender parts, and if we complained of this usage, they then took 4 large poles, placed them in the ground, tied us up to them, and flogged us in a manner too dreadful to behold. The fact that slaves in New York lived in their masters' households, as opposed to separate slave quarters, it exacerbated the effects that slavery had on family life. Since married slaves and slave parents and children in New York were generally owned separately, family life involved an ever-changing network of long-distance relationships. Active parenthood, involving care, support, daily interaction, cohabitation, was intermittent at best. On a daily basis, any non-related black adults in a household often acted as surrogate parents. And parents often lived separately, so that the experience of slave parenthood in New York was like single parenthood. In other words, the central characteristic of New York slave marriage was that spouses had to often live apart. Living apart didn't mean that slave families never saw each other, and when they couldn't, they still tried. Hundreds of runaway slave advertisements published in local New York newspapers often gave clues to where these slaves were going, searching not just for freedom, but for long-lost family members. And if you look at image 3, this is an example of one of these runaway slave advertisements, and this came from a Dyckman family member. It was published on May 27th, 1765 in the New York Gazette. And it was Jacob Dyckman, who was looking for one of his slaves named Will, about 40 years old, 5'8", with very crooked legs. Like most advertisements, he includes a description of what Will was wearing: a short blue coat, homespun trousers, a beaver hat with a hole through the rim. He also includes the name of Will's former masters. One of the reasons he probably did this was exactly because New York slaves often ran away to see family members, so the name of a former master would give a clue as to where that slave was going. Newspaper notices offering rewards for the capture and return of enslaved humans were increasingly common in the 18th and early 19th century. In these notices, owners gave names and voices to the enslaved, with detailed descriptions of their human property. These notices show that slaves were highly skilled workers, often bilingual in English and Dutch, if not trilingual in English, Dutch, and French. They also were musically skilled, often listed as playing either the fiddle or the violin. Although there were legal prohibitions against slaves learning how to read and write, many of these slaves were listed as being able to do both. Many of the ads also noted particular work skills. These slaves who ran away, they could do all sorts of housework. There were bakers, chimney sweepers, butchers, carpenters, farmers. There were slaves who could operate a grist mill. There were slaves who had knowledge of arithmetic and accounts. These skills were not limited to slaves in New York City. In rural New York, slaves performed agricultural labor, but they also learned highly skilled work. New York farms were self-contained units, and a slave had to be able to grow crops, but also tend to livestock, fix buildings, make clothing, clean the house, cook, and care for children. In fact, this vast array of skills reveals one of the biggest differences between slavery in New York and slavery in the southern regions. In the South, most slaves were congregated on large, single-crop plantations, but the diversified economy of the North required slaves to be proficient in a wide variety of skills. In addition to listing their skills, all of the slave ads described the clothing that slaves wore and took with them when they fled. There were homespun coats made of linen and wool, leather or linen trousers, often hats or new shoes. Many of these ads report that slaves took multiple items of clothing with them. A bundle of clothes is often what it says. We can surmise a number of reasons for this. In cold months, slaves may have grabbed extra clothing to keep warm. Some slaves may have grabbed clothes to trade for food or to sell. Others may have grabbed multiple outfits to help with disguise. Finally, many of the runaway slave ads also noted descriptive markings or other physical attributes of the runaways. Here's an example. Scarred over the forehead, walks stooping, lame in one of his fingers, his left ear cut off, lame in one of his knees, scar on his upper lip, scar on his left hand, right foot twisted outwards, marked from the lash. Now, some of these, as Gretchen has noted with me, were probably African markings denoting kinship or other traditional ties, but others, if not most, were no doubt the result of abusive masters. The vast number of runaway slave ads during this time is indicative of just how widespread slavery was. But it also indicates the struggle for freedom that was being fought by enslaved people. The dangers of running away and being caught were dire, but for many, the chance to be free, or to see a spouse, or to visit a child, or to escape the constant oversight of a master for even a short period of time was worth the risk. The codification of slave laws is certainly a sign of increasing repression, but that too suggests growing resistance to oppression. Every new law and every runaway slave advertisement was a signal that slaves were fighting back. They ran away, they openly or secretly disobeyed orders, they stole goods or bartered goods, they illegally assembled. At times, they openly rebelled. The tension between increasingly restrictive regulation of slaves and the desire of slaves to become free came to a head in organized slave revolts in New York in 1712 and 1741, though in both cases, the slaves who were captured and convicted of rebelling were tortured and executed. The initial purpose of slavery was to secure a labor force to do the work of settlement, to do the work that enabled the economy to survive. But as white New Yorkers created a labor class based on African slavery, they also developed racial justifications for the enslavement of Africans above all other groups. These justifications were often gendered. Jennifer Morgan, a historian at NYU, has shown that slave owners used travel narratives to inscribe enslaved women as culturally different, as able to give birth without pain, as able to labor while pregnant, in order to classify Africans as different and justify slavery. As slavery became codified as a legal status, inherited from a mother to her child, white colonists bequeathed what they called the future increase, that is, the future children of slaves, in their wills. In other words, colonists created a market in enslaved women's reproductive potential. Like labor, slave women's reproductive labor was a central component of slavery in both the North and the South. Slave wills and estate inventories listed living slaves and sometimes this future increase to be bequeathed along with their livestock and their furniture. If you take a look at the final image in the handout, this is part of an estate inventory from a Dyckman family member. And if you see the highlighted portion, it's a few rows down, there's 6 cows, lists different furniture, and then it says one man called Blossom, a person thrown right in there with the rest of the inventory. So I've only sort of just started really digging into the Dyckman family records. In addition to these and the runaway slave advertisement, there are some other records that I've already found. The census is a great place to start. In 1800, the United States Census listed Jacob Dyckman as owning 1 slave. 10 years later, we know he owned 2 slaves. The 1790 census lists a widow Dyckman as owning 7 slaves, which was really quite a large number at that time. The census records don't list the names of the slaves, but there are some clues as to who these slaves were, other than the runaway slave ads and the inventories. There were emancipation records. So there are 2 emancipation records that were filed in the state of New York, registering as free persons 2 Dyckman family slaves. One was for a slave named Francis Cujo, and he was freed by Jacob Dyckman in 1809. Now his birth date is listed as 1769, so we know that he was 40 years old when he was freed. Another emancipation record from 1809 was a slave named Harry, who belonged to Jacob's brother, Garrett Dyckman. Harry was 32 when he was freed. On this point of freedom, the end of slavery in New York was a critical turning point in the history of slavery in the nation. But that doesn't mean that it was easy or that it was fast. On the contrary, New Yorkers surrendered slavery with tremendous reluctance. Emancipation required half a century and was accomplished only through incremental measures, suggesting both the degree to which New Yorkers were beholden to slavery and the limitations of the anti-slavery movement here. In fact, the only northern state to outlast New York in preserving slavery was New Jersey, where the last slaves weren't freed until 1865. The central measure that doomed slavery in New York was the Gradual Emancipation Law in 1799, but it freed no one immediately. Instead, it mandated that slave women until age 25 and slave men until age 28 would be indentured servants, that is, bound laborers to those masters who formerly owned them. In other words, with the exception of individual acts of manumission, the earliest that slaves could become free under this law was 1824. Moreover, this law only promised eventual freedom to those born after July 4th, 1799. It wasn't until 1817 that New York finally passed legislation applying to those slaves born before that date. And those slaves would eventually become free on July 4th, 1827, finally bringing an end to slavery in New York after nearly 50 years of trying. With that, I'm going to pass this over.
Good afternoon. I'm going to do a little technical driving here. Put my glasses on first. You see it? Am I good? Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Isabella Vondre, and I'm a culinary historian. I specialize in the mid-Atlantic or middle colonies, 1620 to about 1830. So from the Dutch years all the way through to 1830. And that's what I call the hearth years. The years when we're cooking in the fireplace. Around 1830, we started transitioning to iron stoves, and it gets really academic at that point. So my work focuses primarily on the upper class, because that's where we find the African cooks in the kitchen. But by working the upper class, I also then have to study all the other class structures, because the lower classes, the middling, the enslaved Africans, the indigenous, support the foodways of the upper class. So that way I can see the whole social strata. So Meredith asked me to share with you the question that often comes up. What did the enslaved eat? So some of what I'm going to share with you, you heard from Alex, And it really plays into what the enslaved ate. So we're gonna kind of do a little dance around, and hopefully we'll get to an answer by the end. But this is not the final word. This, like all of what is happening at Dyckman, and actually not just here, but this whole looking at the narrative of what's happening in museums is happening region-wide. This actually has been a trickle-down process that started about 20 years ago. The first site that really took a step and back and look at it was Phillipsburg Manor and what is today Sleepy Hollow. But I'm in a project in New Jersey with this. The state is looking at its museums, so this whole transition of getting more truth to our narrative is happening truly region-wide, and I'm glad to be a part of what's happening here at Dyckman. So, what did they eat? That's always the question. So when we think about what we eat, or what they eat, we have to first look at how food falls, and it really kind of falls into two categories. It's either raw or it's cooked. For history, people in history, and even currently, we really don't eat a lot of raw food. But a lot of the things we eat raw today, historically, they did not eat raw. And people are surprised when things like cucumbers are cooked more often than not in historic food. They're not eaten raw. Salad is cooked. There are instances of raw salad, but it's really not very often. So for the enslaved, what's going to fall in their raw category really is going to be fruit. Like most of us today, we eat raw fruit, and we eat raw nuts. The majority of what they ate and what we eat falls under cooked. So we're going to start answering our question about what they ate by looking at how you get cooked food, because that's really important. What's involved in cooked food is time, a hearth, and that's your stove of the day, fuel, pots and pans, utensils like spoons and knives and things like that, and things to clean up, buckets, water, and soap. The kinds of things that we sort of take for granted. So starting there, we have to then look at the differences of how enslaved are held in the South, the Caribbean, and other places, and then how they're held here in New York. As Alex has mentioned, in the South and other places where you have a few people holding hundreds and hundreds of slaves, but even starting with 20 or more, they are living in separate units, right? And those units, those cabins, you'll see here a chimney stack. They have hearths. They have their own individual way of preparing their food. So this is the interior of our hearth, and this is actually kind of a small one, but this is pretty standard. You know, wherever there is brick or stone on a floor in front of a fireplace, that's also part of the hearth. That's part of the cooking area. It's not just over the fire.
Is this where one family will live?
Yeah, this would be one family, but this is in Georgia, this is in the Carolinas, this is in Alabama, Tennessee, Texas. It depends on the farm. It could be one person, it could be hundreds of people, but this is not, I'm using this just as an example to show you that this is not us. Okay, everyone's get that?
Yes.
This is not us. This is the South. This is the West Indies. This is Brazil. This is not the middle colonies. And when I say the middle colonies, I'm talking the landmass that was once New Netherland, the landmass claimed by the Dutch. So that's New York, New Jersey, Delaware. northern Pennsylvania, and southern Connecticut. And this is really important, okay? Because when people are holding more, they can cook for themselves. They're living separately from their owner. Otherwise, there has to be a staff of cooks to cook for all those hundreds of people. So it's cheaper to give them rations, to give them a place, to give them the stuff, and say, go cook your own food. But here in New York, the enslaved are held differently. We have a population being held by everyone except for the poorest of the poor Europeans. And that's just not only in Manhattan, that is the entire state. Repeatedly, we have tenant farmers, people who are renting their farms with enslaved. We have in urban environments and agricultural environments, but we don't have hundreds. We have one over here, another, the next farm will have two, the next farm may have another two, right? Currently, there are only 3 places where I'm able to document where the enslaved are living by themselves in a separate building with their own hearth. The first is Johnson Hall, and this is up in the Mohawk Valley. And to the right is that stone building, and that's called a blockhouse. We have documents that support the enslaved living in that building. And inside that building is a hearth. This hearth actually was only put in 2 years ago. In the foundation of the blockhouse, while they were restoring the floor, they found the footprint of the hearth. So they were able to put it back in. And even at that, what they put in, this is a state site, the hearth floor is not big enough. The original hearth, the stone that appears in front of the fireplace, would have been bigger. The other place we have in our area where we know the enslaved were living separately is Phillipsburg Manor in Tarrytown. When Adolf Philipp died in 1750, there was an inventory taken. There were 23 enslaved men, women, and children on that site, and they also made note of a Negro house. We don't know, however, where that house stood. It either was not part of the property that the museum owned at that point when they did the archaeological research on this site, or it was a wooden building with a packed dirt floor, which would have left no footprint. There is some speculation that the miller on this property may have lived in the lower part where the dairy is and the kitchen. But at least we have documentation supporting the enslaved having a separate place. And the one thing about this site as well, there is no European living at this portion of this property on a daily basis. Phillipsburg Manor originally was 52,000 acres. So it had 2 central hubs, one in Yonkers, which is now Phillips Manor Hall, and then this is called the Upper Mills, and this one is in Sleepy Hollow. So the enslaved controlled 500 acres around this house, which is more of a warehouse than where the family lived. And we know that they had their own ability to cook for themselves. Now, what we have, the other place is Day Mansion in Wayne, New Jersey, who right now, as we are speaking, they started this project this summer are doing archaeological digs on that property to see if they can find the outbuildings. We've got documents that say the enslaved lived in a separate building, but currently they're trying to figure out where that building stood. What we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of indications are enslaved living in cellars, kitchens, and garrets. And garrets are attics. Now, and this is everywhere. In Manhattan, in the townhouses, they live somewhere in the house. In historic Huguenot Street, in New Paltz, they lived in a cellar. They slept on boards. So imagine a New York winter where you have a stone building with stones that go down into the floor to create the cellar, a packed dirt floor, and no heat. That's where they lived. They did that in Mabee Farm. Mabee Farm had anywhere from 8 to 12 enslaved there. The couple of houses at historic Huguenot Street had anywhere from 6 to 15 slaves between several different houses. But they don't have, in all of these variations of where they are living, they do not have a way to prepare food for themselves. So next we have to consider cooking. Talk about time. It takes time to cook, right? Even today we want it done in 20 minutes. So if you have an enslaved person and they need time to cook, that means you're taking daylight hours to allow them that time to cook, or you have to take candles, which are expensive, to give them light to cook by. They can't cook in the dark. That's a fire, that's your property, that's your house, that's them. So that's that. Fuel. The hearth consumes wood, unlike your electric bill. It never stops. New York is colder than it is hot. And when we cook on a hearth, we're really not cooking over the flame, we're cooking over ember. So it's like working on charcoal. But to get that charcoal, you gotta burn a big fire. So even to cook a soup or stew, you're using fuel. Firewood is a commodity that people could use to pay their rent with. Or you've got to go out the wood and gather that, right? So again, time equals labor. Then there's the cost of the pots, the pans, the food itself, the utensils, and you're gonna put a knife in a hand of somebody who is living in your house, right? So there's all of these things that come into play. So is it worth it? Is it worth all that trouble and all that hassle and all that expense if you only have one enslaved person? If you only have 2 enslaved people? If you only have 3 enslaved people? Is it worth it? No, it's not cost effective. So when we look at what the enslaved eat, in many ways we have to look at who was holding them. The rule of thumb, honestly, is they ate leftovers. They ate the bits. But in many cases, their food is equal to the feed of animals. If there is a grain that shows up around enslaved eating, it's Indian meal or cornmeal. Indian meal is given to enslaved throughout the diaspora, and that includes here in New York. The Dutch, however, learn and start to love Indian meal very early in the 17th century. When they come here, they start eating a dish called sampan. And it is a cornmeal mush with milk. The natives ate it without the milk. The Dutch bring the cows here, And that is a very common supper for them. So if they're eating it, they're going to give it to their enslaved. Another thing that if we see coming up, just want to read you one quote. There is a very popular memoir that's used. A woman named Anne Grant actually grew up in Albany, and she wrote a memoir of her younger growing up. And she described Albany, and in one sentence she says, at the other end of town, there was a fertile plain about 3 miles in length and near a mile broad. This was all divided into lots where every inhabitant raised Indian corn sufficient for the food of 2 or 3 slaves, the greatest number that each family ever possessed, and for their horses, pigs, and poultry. When we look at meat, like the South had rations, and so there are the 3 M's that show up a lot. Meat, which was salted pork, meal, which was Indian or cornmeal, and molasses. So for our region, the meat will be salted provisions. So we look at Warren Johnson's journal from 1761, and he said, I saw the wild pigeons in great flocks, at which the Dutch are very much rejoiced, as they chiefly live on them till winter. They are also a great relief to others, particularly the Negroes, who live on salt provisions all winter. Right? So they're eating salted pork. Pork is brought here by the Dutch, and it thrives. Most of what we eat today in New York, some of the things that are imported from the Caribbean and other countries, was brought here by Dutch settlers. One of the early books that give us a great indication of this is a report written by Adrian van der Dark. He was a Yonker. He started out in Rensselaerswyck in Albany, and then he came to New York and was in constant argument with Peter Stuyvesant. But to sell the new colony, he wrote this extensive report. He spent a lot of time with the indigenous in the Mohawk River Valley area, and he talks about every tree, every seed, every fish in the water. He tells us all the plants and seeds that the Dutch colonists came and how they thrived. There was very little that the Europeans brought here that did not thrive. The one crop that shows up in the South that the Europeans brought here as well that didn't do well was broad beans, right? They're called horse beans. And he talks about how the pods fill out, but how the beans don't grow. You just get these fat pods. But there are a lot of foods that grew in the South that don't show up here, right? So collard greens don't show up here. We have mustard greens, we've got kale, we've got cabbage, we've got kohlrabis, we've got a lot pokeweed, lamb's quarter, but collard greens are not on our list here. And pork is eaten by the Dutch, it's by the English, the Germans, the French, the Scots. Very popular, common. Also, dairy products. New York exports a lot of butter. We're known for having actually very salty butter. The drink that is given to the enslaved from that, because most of the dairying was done by enslaved women, was buttermilk. And that's actually a waste product. It's soured milk, but it's a waste product from producing butter. Peas. Field peas. For us, the field pea is actually a green pea. We know at Johnson Hall, they grew acres and acres of them. You find them all throughout the state. So if they're going to have any kind of peas or beans, green peas show up a lot. Fresh greens. Again, all the leafy greens were around except for the collards. All of these things show up in a number of sources, but in bits, but not necessarily in relation to rations. They're not always given, like in the South, we have documents like every 2 weeks they're given 5 pounds of flour, they're given a jug of molasses, they're given this, because you have so many people. But here, we haven't mentioned, oh, we saw somebody selling cornmeal, or they're gonna have a stew over here and it's gonna be peas. But on the day-to-day, more often than not, what the enslaved ate were lesser leftovers from their owner's table. I also recently found a quote, and I can't find where it was, so I'm in a search for that, where a European woman was visiting, and she was appalled because this enslaved person actually ate at the same table with the family she was visiting, because they only had one. And his black hoof was put in the same bowl as her white ham. Right? But that was common, because they are not considered people. They are considered property. When we look at the remains, the reports that have come out from remains of like the African burial ground, or those that were reinterred from Schuyler Mansion, what we are seeing is malnutrition. They're not getting enough. We're seeing oddly shaped shoulders and arms, bones that are too small for the stretch and the ligaments, the damage, because they're doing a lot of physical work and they don't have the calories they need for the work that they're doing. In the South and in other places too, you have gardens and provisioning grounds. Again, we don't see that here. We see that in places like Phillipsburg Manor, where you have a lot of slaves living by themselves and no European around, and they're supplementing their diet. But on the day-to-day, we don't see that. So these are just, this way, some of the sites where we know the enslaved were, and just in the immediate area. So this is Courtland Manor. They held upwards of 12, most of them women. They had 2 men and 10 women over the time period. This is Maybe Farm. And this is in Schenectady, New York. They had anywhere from 7 to 12, most of them men. And they slept in an unfinished cellar in this house. It was horrific. So again, the salt pork, the cornmeal, the molasses, that's part of the rations. We have the salt pork. We have, I'm able to find the cornmeal. I'm not able so far to find the molasses coming up on a regular basis, because we have a lot of sugar here. A lot of the families in New York actually have sugar plantations, or their families have sugar plantations. And when Europeans come here, they comment on the luxurious food that they're being served and how much sugar is there. So this is a mill at Phillipsburg Manor. Many of the millers in New York were enslaved men. You know, we want to get amazed at the skill set that the enslaved have. But please understand, when we look for Africa in New York, it's not in the food. It is in the intellect. It is in the transference of skills. Right? Agriculture happens in West Africa. Milling happens in West Africa. Cooking happens in West Africa. They're just having to learn how to do it in the European way. But this is not something that they're not familiar with. But again, this is Caesar, the miller here, spoke 4 languages, right? Because the tenants of the Phillips were from everywhere. And when this mill was in operation, it made 5,000 pounds of flour a day. This is not a couple hundred pounds of flour. This flour is a major export for New York. And it is one of the things that you never see, or I haven't seen so far, enslaved using to sell or barter, right? They don't do it with cash crops. They will do it with Indian meal because it's considered feed. They can do it with nuts. They can do it with skins from possums or raccoons, but they're not trading in any of the cash crops. Another mill, another Charlotte mill. Peas, pea soup, constantly. And this pea soup is in the receipt books of every culture that is here. When I look at Dutch receipt books, when I look at German receipt books, when I look at French receipt books, when I find English, because it is a staple, right? Dates back to the medieval period. You know, it's your first travel food is pea soup. Leafy greens, this is borage. This is one that was brought here. We don't eat this anymore, and that's one of the things too when we think about the food that the Europeans had. Our food has shrunk. They ate a lot more than we did. What's missing? We have records to indicate that black-eyed peas were in the area. In America's first cookbook, Amelia Simmons published the same book twice, because the first version in 1796, down in Hartford, her editor made a lot of changes, made some mistakes, like the gingerbread recipe has no ginger in it. But in the front of that book, she actually gives you a how to buy your food guide. And one of the peas or beans that she lists are called, I never pronounce it right, calabansi. And she describes a yellowish bean but a black spot, right? We know by 1795, 1796, they're all up and down the seaboard and that they're in Rhode Island. What I have yet to find, though, is a record of a farmer actually growing them, right? So there's in the area of who's actually growing them. The same with sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes get moved to Europe very early, but they're considered a luxury food. Where in the South, they're a common food. In our area, they're considered a luxury food. They don't actually become a common crop until almost the 19th century. Again, who's growing them? I can find growing records for other potatoes, but not for sweet potatoes or not for yams. But they're showing up in English cookbooks that are used here. Far more readily showing up are squash and pumpkins, right? Which are native to our area. So this is me on one of these crazy Dutch hearths. So when we talk about cooking over the fire, that's it, right? You're burning that big fire for the embers. Those two Dutch ovens, they are metal bake kettles. And they're called Dutch ovens because the Dutch use them so prolifically in trading. So that big stock pot in your kitchen with the lid on it that you call a Dutch oven has a long history, right? So there are a couple of roasts in there, and I'm starting some fish. This hearth is at Van Courtland Manor. This is a reconstructed hearth. Very few of these hearths, we have a lot of them around, but very few of them are usable anymore. That's a carrot pudding. Now, one of the things about carrots, in many of the references, sweet potatoes are being used as carrots because they're the same color, and when you cook them, they're both sweet. So it's showing up that way, and that's like a souffle. This is an oven. So when we talk about the enslaved in the house eating, who's feeding them? Who's doing the cooking? If they are in a tenant house or mainly a tenant or lower class house where the wife, the European wife, does the cooking, they're eating her cooking. Because they can't afford an enslaved cook. The enslaved cooks are some of the most expensive enslaved you can buy. Because they're not just your common cook. You know, and right now in our culture, we really downplayed the title of cook. These women are Michelin trained chefs and more. Because they have to know how to butcher, they have to know how to do the preservation work, they have to know how to do all this kind of baking. The common baked good is puff pastry, right? They're making this every day. So in the larger houses, so when we look at Schuyler, the Schuylers, you know, Eliza Hamilton's family, the Van Rensselaers and all that, these people were rich when they arrived. These women have never been in the kitchen. So their first cooks were European, their next cook was an enslaved woman, and from that point on, she's an enslaved woman. And so when we're looking at the upper class, that's what we're seeing. So my question now in my research is, would an enslaved cook, particularly in the upper houses, have the time to cook for the enslaved? When we look at dinner in the upper houses, a 3-course meal, you know, we think, you know, soup, salad, entree, something like that, and dessert. That is late 19th century. When we get into the 18th century, early 19th century, a course has to have minimum 5 dishes on that table. Average 7 to 9, upwards of 21. 2 courses, cannot repeat. Your 3rd course is dessert, more food. Then they have to do all the preservation work. And remember, this is pre-restaurant culture, so you can't take your friends out. So when people come to visit, you've got to feed them. They're staying with you, they're staying for a couple of weeks. So when you're looking at the upper class, these women are cooking anywhere from 10 to 20 people every day. Would they have time to cook for the enslaved? Or is that the work of an assistant that they're training? So that's where my research is going now. In the bigger houses, who is cooking for the enslaved? Because they are living in the house or in some outbuilding that does not have a hearth. Or if they have a hearth, who's doing that cooking? Is that an assistant that's being put in there? Or is that one of the field hands who has been out working all day and going in and cook? That doesn't really make sense to me. And a lot of this we're just having to use just common sense with because we honestly don't have the documents. We're getting more documents. A lot of the early documents that were in in Dutch have been translated by Charles Geering and his team for the last 30 years. We're getting a plethora of documents starting now to come out of Holland about particularly the Dutch period. But a lot of those documents we lost because they were sold for scrap paper. So a lot of this, Alex and I were talking about it, it's a sentence here, it's a word there, it's a clue that will lead you somewhere else. So I would love to be able to say to you, they ate blah, 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 blah. But honestly, they ate leftovers. They ate bits. They ate much, maybe. But whatever they ate, they didn't eat enough. Thank you.
This was absolutely terrific and very enlightening. I learned a lot. A couple of questions occurred to me as I was listening, and I will throw out my questions first, and then I'll ask the audience if you have questions. Alex, it occurred to me that we don't know what happens after emancipation in New York. Are the enslaved all emancipated, or are they sold south?
Should I answer that? So there are different scenarios. Since emancipation was piecemeal, they were first individual acts of manumission. So you had slaves who were manumitted individually by their masters before the Emancipation Law, which was more widespread, took effect. But then that created the problem of free blacks in New York who were supposed to be free, but were of course vulnerable to slave catchers who would illegally sell them as slaves in the South. So they weren't legally re-enslaved, but they were illegally some captured and enslaved. And those who weren't were always vulnerable to the threat of being captured.
And Levana, a question that occurred to me, we know, for example, in South Carolina, we know in Georgia that slavers actually went to Africa to find people that knew how to grow rice. We know that. Do we know whether or not they went to find cooks? They ever went to find cooks?
No. No. And
No, we don't know, or
no, we don't know. No, I don't think so. Where my work is right now, anytime we talk about enslaved cooks, we want to dump them, in the middle of cooking, right? They already know how to cook, but who trained them?
Right.
So right now, a lot of my work is, and I just had a long conversation with a Dutch culinary historian, Peter Rose, about this. In the 1660s, so the day the English take over, 1664, there's a ship of 300 enslaved in the harbor. So I'm starting a story, because we have to make some stories. And that story is that one of those women on that ship is going to get trained to be a cook. So you have a woman coming with the worst PTSD. She's going onto the block, she's going to be sold, she's going to be put into a kitchen, and she's going to have to learn how to cook. So this training period will take about 3 years. After that point, I believe those initial cooks will train the other cooks. It is common for children to be given away at age 3. So they are presented to a European child within the household at the age of 3. They're given something and a pair of shoes. And Alice talked about the shoes. By law, it was the owner's responsibility to make sure their enslaved were clothed. Because, so in a lot of the records I go through, I can't find food records, but I find shoes after shoes after shoes. So if a child grows up in a kitchen, by the time they're like 12 and 15, they got all the skills they need to be a cook. And I'm using actually a real woman. Her name was Hannah Till, but she was actually born in the colony. And she was George Washington's cook for 6.5 years of the Revolutionary War. And she grew up in the kitchen, was always sold as a cook, and is only known as a cook. And I think that they need that time because there's so much to learn in European cooking, and it's so different from West African cooking. Like there's no baking in West Africa, and there's a lot of baking in Europe. So they have to learn all that pastry work. They have to learn how to do all the butchering and things like that. So I think that they are looking at young women initially that have some way around a fire, and then they're teaching them everything else they need to know.
Would anyone in the audience like to ask a question? Yes.
I have just 3 short ones. What's the, I know it's a wide period, but you were talking about being malnourished. What's the life expectancy that we're talking about?
The average life expectancy for a female slave throughout the period, throughout enslavement in New York is 32 years. 32. And the life expectancy for a man is 30. So if they're over 35, they're old.
What
Also-
about the masters?
They live into the 80s and 90s. Yeah, they live long.
Why didn't they eat more raw food, as you call it?
It's hard to digest. Raw food is actually not easy to digest.
Interesting. Also, this is for everyone, so are you seeing information about sexual violation?
Oh,
Everyone.
yes. Everywhere. As especially when the importation from Africa law stops. So before we get to the gradual manumission laws, there are laws that say you can't import from Africa anymore. It is not as, breeding is not as prevalent here, but it does happen.
Also, remember in New York, unlike in the South, in New York, slaves and white family members, I mean, they're literally living on top of one another within the same household.
Thank you.
I had the incredible experience recently of reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' Water Dancer. And if any of you haven't read this novel yet, it's unbelievable.
He said he read, in writing this book, everything that he could put his hands on regarding the enslaved, or the tasked, as he calls them in the book. And I have so many questions, but I have a less important one just because I can't grasp it all. I just finished the book and it's incredible. But he talks about his character, the main character, grew up a slave in Virginia, and he talks about some of the things that he ate. He lived in a community, the Warrens they called it, and each family, most of the women had access to a hearth to cook. And he talks about, it's such an incredible book, he talks about something called ash cake, and I can imagine what it is, but if you would describe it, that would be it.
Ash cake is actually a variation of hot water cornbread. It is cornmeal where you put hot boiling water in it. I grew up eating a variation of ash cake. The hot water actually cooks the cornmeal. Or you mix it with cornmeal with cold water, and you shape it to a disc or a cake, and you put it in the embers of the fire, or the ash of the fire, and that bakes it. And then you rinse it off to get the extra ash off. But depending on the wood you use, it actually the ash gives a salty taste to it because you don't really have salt. You know, we forget that salt was an imported ingredient, so other than for salting meat, salt is really expensive. A hoe cake is the same as an ash cake, except it's a hoe blade, you know, is a flat metal blade, so that's like a griddle. So you put that on top of the ember, so it just keeps the ash out of it. You can wrap it in leaves. In the South, they would use plantain leaves or other leaves to wrap it in, which also impart a taste. But really, it's just a variation of cornbread. In Amelia Simmons' book from 1796, she actually gives a recipe for Johnny cake or hoe cake. So everybody ate it. You know, sometimes it's the great equalizer. It is there. It is just not preferred, particularly among the upper class. They want white bread. They are actually eating French bread.
Hi, so you mentioned,
Would you?
Hi, so you mentioned earlier the African burial ground here in Inwood, I think near 212th Street. And I was wondering if you could talk more about the history of the burial ground and how big it was, how many people were buried there, and how closely related it is to the Dyckman house. And what is the current status, knowing that it's built, right now it's been redeveloped and has a parking lot over it, I think. If you could talk more about that.
Sure. So the slave burial ground is present day roughly 212th Street between Broadway and 10th Avenue. Originally, that's where the slaves from the Dyckmans and the Nagels, you know, these are all the street names that we know from around the neighborhood. These are where this is where the slaves of the landowners, the wealthy landowners who lived in what's now Upper Manhattan, buried their slaves, and then they were originally buried, the family members were originally buried obviously in a separate cemetery. And when the city started to grow northward, the wealthy landowner family members were moved to a cemetery in the Bronx. And of course the slave burial ground was just completely ignored and paved over. Nothing had been moved as had been done with the wealthy landowners' remains. So it was paved over. And then there's some record in a book that in 1903, there were a lot of changes happening in the early 1900s in Inwood, or what's now Inwood. We started to get, this is obviously before a lot of people lived here. I don't know if those of you who live in this neighborhood know, but there was almost nothing in this neighborhood until the 1920s and 30s because there was no way to get here. So we start to get the subway coming to what is now Uptown. We start to get, the Kingsbridge Road is Broadway at that point, but then at some point they actually pave it and make it Broadway. The underground, first we get the above ground, first we get what's now the 1 train, and then the more challenging, of course, is bringing what's now the A train uptown. So around the time of right before all of these changes, in 1903, some of the slave remains are kind of rediscovered. And again, nothing really happens with them. It's not, unfortunately, not treated. It was completely treated in a disrespectful manner. And today, that site is a public school, the Shirakapak School, and there's a parking lot. I don't know about development plans for the parking lot. So that used to be obviously part of the Dyckman property. They owned, land was constantly changing hands, but they owned roughly from 190th Street, present day, to 215th Street, all the way from river to river. So that would have been their property. Obviously, it's no longer part of our property. It's privately, part I think is privately owned and part is the Department of Education, the city owns it.
So I've seen a photograph of some of the bones that were disinterred when they were digging up 10th Avenue. Do you know if anything has survived any of those? I mean, I know that people came and just took the bones.
Yeah.
I mean, is everything gone? Did any of the archaeologists who were working at that time save them? Is there anything left of it at all?
Not to my knowledge. There were amateur archaeologists who were working in this neighborhood in the early 1900s, and we have a lot of their collections, and it's a lot of fragments from kitchen implements and things like that, and pottery. To my knowledge, nothing of that has survived from the slave
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
So, in your knowledge, has enough, I don't know what's kind of in the back rooms of various museums. I mean, is it possible that something remains there? Or are you pretty certain that, there is nothing to...
Museums have very strict guidelines concerning the acquisition or disposal of human remains. And most history museums do not have any human remains. Natural history museums do have some human remains, but it's doubtful. It would be doubtful that there are any remains from the Dyckman.
Thanks.
It's also doubtful that there's any remains left at the site.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because they graded down like 10 feet. So in fact, the graves would have been would be in the air now, above the faculty parking lot at the school. Yeah.
One thing, I can't speak to Inwood, but one of the things that is happening with the whole change of conversation around enslavement in our region is how people are treating the burial grounds. In Brooklyn, they found one in a public park. And if I'm not mistaken, sometime over the summer, they just rededicated that one. And so there's a plaque there now. They're doing that in a couple of places in Bergen County where they have found some. They're doing that up in Hyde Park, New York. So the burial grounds are common, and people as we work through how we deal with the language around enslavement, they're also working through what do we do around acknowledgement of the burial grounds. So I know that New York City is part of that conversation, but just know, again, this is happening region-wide. And people are trying to correct past mistakes as best as they can.
Can you please, when you say people, I was involved the other night on the vigil. I'm hopefully some other people.
I was too.
You were there, right? It was beautiful. There was a vigil, there was an interfaith ceremony. Just to honor the fact that these people died there and there's nothing. And my understanding was that this is, like you said, a larger project than just this particular spot. Right?
Yeah, but all of these projects are happening individually. So that is the challenge.
That is the challenge, that all of these projects are happening individually. And each museum is connected to a network. Like the Dyckman House is connected to the city, the Dyckman House is connected to the state, the Dyckman House is connected to the bigger historical picture. So those conversations are happening all along that local way. But literally, people are digging up their backyard and finding a burial ground. Because for many challenges, our minds around history stop in the 20th century. We're not looking at maps that go back to the 18th century or the 17th century. Like the African burial ground, it was on maps in the 17th and 18th century. But people didn't think to look back that far, or they chose not to look back that far. So communities are working with historical societies, communities are working with things in their own neighborhood, trying to rectify as best they can. So it's really on that local community level that things are happening. And a lot of the museums are the springboard for getting those conversations out there.
And I'll say, this is a national problem as well, but in New York State, because we're such an old state, the Albany, I live upstate, and Albany Medical Center, just up the river, decided that they were going to expand. And apparently, in the late 19th century, when they buried people that died who were indigent, they just took them right outside the back door and buried them. So when Albany Med decided they were going to expand, they started digging for their new parking lot, and guess what they found? They found basically the potter's field, the poor people. They were black, they were white, they were poor. And as they excavated more and more for the parking lot, they started to they found over 100 bodies. And they kept excavating, looking, hoping it would end. And they found this huge number of bodies. So I think it's not even just an issue for museums, it's an issue for our public institutions as well. And there are so many of these places that poor people, Native people, African people, people who didn't have access to these fancy cemeteries, were just planted where they just put anywhere. And it's an enormous issue, not just for museums, but for other kinds of institutions as well. Yes.
So one of the ways in which those of us who are not sort of institutionally connected can support this idea of marking that place. And I'm also wondering if the fact that part of it at least is on a public school, which is city land, would ease that process a little bit. It's not all on private land.
In my experience, it makes it much more challenging. So we did a press conference with our then Senator Marisol Alcantara a couple of years ago to bring awareness to the slave burial ground. And we've been trying to get some sort of commemorative plaque for the site. First, we reached out to the Department of Education, and they said, well, if you want to do something, it would be not technically on Department of Education property, it would be on Department of Transportation property, meaning the sidewalk. So then we reached out to the Department of Transportation, and you can see that that has gone literally nowhere. But one thing, now that Marisol is no longer in office, we've been trying to work with Carmen de la Rosa's office to try and get somewhere with that. So I would say reach out to your elected officials, and hopefully we can try and get this moving somewhere.
Yes.
I'm happy to talk afterwards. I'm Senator Jackson's Deputy Chief of Staff.
Fabulous.
And I also had a quick question for Lavada. So I'm wondering about the presence of indigenous people, and I know this is probably even harder to track, but did you get a sense that especially working class folks and enslaved people, there was mixing with indigenous foodways? Was there ever enough crossover of populations coexisting in the same location for any of those foodways to kind of cross over? I know you talked about the Indian meal.
Yeah, they were, but not this far down. We do have that up in the Mohawk Valley region. We have that as we get closer to Canada. But particularly up around Johnson Hall, because he was the English government representative for the Native population. His second wife was a Native, and a lot of major gatherings happened at and around that property. So we're
Jackson Whites, that group of Dutch, Indian, African, in New Jersey, in between New Jersey and New York.
New York. So I'm not. So
I don't know.
But yes, there is that crossover. And so, in fact, in talking, a conversation I, like I said, just had with Peter Rose, she was saying with some Seneca that she had had conversations with, that one of their food historians had told her that it was the Dutch who taught the Indians to eat pork. So it's going both ways. So that whole relationship is going both ways. And they're trying to recover their recipes as well.
I'm surprised you haven't mentioned chickens.
That's just what I was gonna ask.
They eat eggs, were they chickens?
Eggs. There's chickens and there's eggs. People don't eat chicken the way we eat chicken. We eat chicken all the time now, but chicken was a special occasion dish. So you fed a lot more people with eggs, and so we have a lot of recipes with eggs. We do have some records or mentions, particularly around the celebration of Pinkster, which is Pentecost, of the enslaved having chicken. So yes, it is there, but it is more, it's an expensive meat, right? So you're gonna eat the eggs. But the eggs are for eating, but they're also for baking. So there's a lot of cakes, and a lot of these recipes start with 20 eggs, and I just wrote one down that started with 70 eggs. And you don't get eggs all year. So it's about this time that chickens actually stop laying eggs. So yeah, we get them all year because we leave the lights on in the hatcheries. But chickens don't lay out eggs all year, but yes, chicken is there. But it's not deep fat fried, it's fricasseed, or it's roasted.
I have a question about the cooks. And I say this from the perspective of someone who doesn't cook. But it seems to me that if an enslaved person isn't allowed to read, how do they remember all these recipes?
That law does not exist here in New York. As far as I know, they're allowed to read and to write. I've always, in my training, was told that they were allowed to read and to write. That's a Southern law. But also, one of the things that come into play here, this is about Africa in the kitchen. Africa and life. One of the lies that or one of the challenges that has always been used against the enslaved was that they did not come from an oral culture. I mean, they didn't come from a written culture. They came from an oral culture. But just think about that. If you were the descendant of a culture that everything was about memory, everything was about showing you how to do something and you being able to repeat it exactly, what would your memory be like? How many times would I have to show you how to do something, especially when your life depended on you getting it right? How many times would I have to do that? Not very many. That is a total plus for the cooks. Because when we look at the receipt books, in all honesty, they're not the everyday dishes. They're the special occasion dishes. It's the cakes where it's science and it's gotta be exact. It's the specialty pies, it's the specialty sauces. But the day-to-day soups and stews and side dishes, or how you dress vegetables, how you prepare vegetables, that's not what we're finding in the manuscript cookbooks.
No.
So even the European woman walked around with a lot of that information in their heads. We are, and you have to remember too, we are at a culture now where paper is so common, we find it on the ground. Remember, paper was expensive. Paper was handmade. Ink had to be made. Things really, this whole list and notes and, you know, the peel off Post-it notepads, that is so not there. You know, so memory drives more, and that is one of our challenges as historians. People didn't write things down because why? They wrote the important things down. But how you made a soup is not important. So that doesn't get written down. So everybody is coming from a more memory-based culture than we want to give them credit for.
I just wanted to ask, I'm curious about the cakes, the sugar, because I know that in the Caribbean, for example, sugar was grown and they actually ate more sweet stuff than back in Europe. So I'm curious about here, like how much did it make it here, and because of all the baking that happened?
We have letters from European visitors that are worried about people who live here. They are worried because the fruit, remember, our ground has not been farmed on for, you know, a couple thousand years. So any seed you put in is flourishing. So the fruits are sweeter, the vegetables are better quality. So they're eating so much sweet fruit, they're eating all the sugar, you know, and we have sweet meats. So sweet meats are dried fruit or fruit and sugar, or fruit and brandy, right? So these are the recipes that are common. And these are the things that when I look at the journals of visiting Europeans or other things that are popping up, this is what people are talking about, because our wheat and butter that we grow here in New York as our cash crop go to the West Indies and is being traded for sugar. And that sugar is going to Europe, but a lot of that sugar is coming back here. The molasses, they're taking to Massachusetts where the distilleries are, and that's being turned into rum. So we have some molasses here, but not much, because they want it into rum. And a number of our Dutch families, and I know even through the 18th century, we keep talking about the Dutch, even though we're not a Dutch colony, please be clear. The Dutch are running the show. They came early. When the English came, some of them changed their names, a lot of them didn't. But when you look at the political positions, when you look at the people on the list, there's a list of like who are the wealthiest people in the neighborhoods. They're all these old Dutch families, or a lot of them are Scottish families because of the religious issues, went to the Netherlands and then came here. Yeah. So they're running the show. And the sugar is king. They're trading it for sugar. They're not suffering.
And keep in mind that when they first come, it's fur, right? And the Dutch make a fortune in the fur trade. And those furs are very desirable in Europe, and they're making a lot of money before the English
And they also
get here.
control the spice trade. You know, we think of the enslaved Africans, but we don't talk about the enslaved
Indonesians. I mean, the Dutch went into the Spice Islands, killed half the population, brought in Africans, and then took over the spice trade. So this money is flowing. I mean, these people are wealthier than a lot of our wealthy now.
They're very open, very rich.
Yeah,
There's a wonderful book about the Dutch, called, and it's called An Embarrassment of Riches, which really, it really gives you a kind of vivid picture of Dutch culture and what the Dutch were doing early on.
Oh, right now, if you want to see it, the Met has an exhibit of Dutch master paintings out of their own collection. So they haven't brought anybody else's over. It's out of the Met's collection, and it'll be up for another 8 months. So go down to the Met, and because it is the time of the master painters of realism. So what you're seeing is coming up here.
Yes.
Since we're talking about resources, and I want to thank you so much for teaching us. On October 20th, I went to the Riverside Church and listened to the Reverend Barber. He talked about stolen hands. We are stealing people's hands here. We're not giving them an opportunity to live. And stolen lands. And his speech is on the Riverside Church, whatever it is, recordings. You could listen while you're doing the dishes. And he spoke about the 7 sins of white supremacy. White supremacy makes the laws. White supremacy has the religion. White supremacy has the economics and biology and the corruptible courts.
Tells the story it wants to tell, too, right?
That's right. So I encourage you to get on your computer. It happened just October 20th. Stolen hands, stolen lands, from 1619 to a just future. And that's what we need. We need to teach our kids that we all live on this earth and no one is better than anybody else and we share. And I say teach the kids because by the time they are adults, they become fire-breathing dragons with power.
Close this library in 6 weeks, so we won't have any more programs like this anymore. Please, 6 weeks.
Demolish. Use the D word.
6 weeks. No more programs like this. This place is closing in 6 weeks. Have a temporary one.
They're gonna be
Size of a studio apartment.
they're building a beautiful new, that might actually be accessible. Junior.
We thought you left.
I like that it's a good way.
We have a few more questions.
You said something about malnutrition. Am I wrong? Yes. I am wrong. No, I said. Okay, so you said something about malnutrition, but you know, the way you described it is like the slaves were living like right in there with the families, right? You said there were 2-3 slaves per family. They were living in the cellar or the attic. They were sleeping near the hearth. Who knows, right? How could they prevent these people from eating, you know, when they're little girls? They're cooking, right?
First, you have to consider them to be people. Let's start with considering them to be people.
They're not considered people. They're not people. They're not family. They are property.
Are you saying that New York in some way is even a little bit even more twisted because we literally had these people in our homes?
No, okay, first of all, you did not have them in your home. I did not have them in my home. Please understand, we're taking a snapshot of a window of 600 years of history. To understand what is happening around enslavement, you can't start in the 17th century. You have to go back to the Middle Ages. You have to go back to when people stopped looking to the east and started looking to the west. There's a shift in consciousness that happens during the Crusades, when normal, everyday Europeans went into the Middle East and got a taste of the good life. Because remember, they were looking to India for spices, right? They were looking to China for stuff. They wanted to emulate Asian and Middle Eastern cultures. So without studying a longer breadth of history, what is happening in the 17th and 18th century makes absolutely no sense. And that's the struggle that many people have. You can't just look at this 100 years. You really have to, my work as a culinary historian, I started studying 12th century, 13th century, and I have to work my way up. Because you have to look at the development of ships, you have to look at the breakdown of the Silk Road, you have to look at stuff stopped going overland and goes to the water, and who's fighting who and for what, and it's about power, and it's about all that. But all that wars and stuff that England and France and Spain are having in the 17th and 18th century, that stuff is like 200 or 300 years old.
Understood, I'm just saying that.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense, I get that. It is challenging.
Right, to add to that, when students learn about slavery, even in schools, and they say, how could you treat other people like that? But really the question is, how did people suddenly stop treating other people like that? The history of slavery was so widespread and so long-lasting and normalized. Right, and the question is, how did anti-slavery actually come into being? That's really the historical question.
I wonder, I would like to ask both of you, so what do you think was going on at the Dyckman Farmhouse? What can we learn from the work that both of you have done, that each of you have done, about the Dyckman? And I know, Alex, I know you're not finished with your work, but what do we know, what do we think so far? And I'll use that as a great segue for us to, the Dyckman Farmhouse is going to reopen at 4:30. And there's a wonderful contemporary art installation there and that addresses this issue. And I think we should, but I just wanted to say, what do you think? This is speculation, we don't know yet. There's more work to be done, but what do you think? Who wants to go first?
I think that we can use the Dyckman House as a place in the neighborhood to go and reflect on our own lives. Because they're doing what is common. They're not doing anything exceptional. But one of the things, when we talk about the anti-slavery movement, one of the impacts of enslavement, and this is one of the things I always contemplate, you can free people, but at what point do we as a country stop teaching hate? When you as a child are given another child, at some point you have to stop them from being friends. You have to teach inferiority. You have to teach betterment. Kids will play with whomever wants to play. But at some point, they have to be separated. And that's a conversation that we as a country have never had. So when you go into the Dyckman House, for me, it is about looking at the structure, looking at all of the people, all the good that they brought to play, the work of the enslaved, the property and the development of the family, and I walk out of there saying, how can I do better? How am I treating people and how do I do better?
And just to add to that, part of the reason that it's so hard to find some of the specifics is because the experiences of the slaves there were just like the experiences of slaves on all the other farms in upstate New York. And those experiences were so normalized and so common and so accepted that a lot of travelers didn't even mention them. They would go and they would stay at a household and they would have a great meal and have a great time, and the slaves would be the ones there serving them and doing the work, but they wouldn't appear in the records because they were just there in the background, unseen, despite how much work they were doing. And I would also just like to add, if anyone has any ideas of specifics that you want to learn about or that you'd like to see, that could be really helpful for me for research, please let me know. I would really appreciate it.
I have some first-person books. Do you have cards? Yes.
So I think, oh, last question?
Go ahead, Joanna.
Thank you. I was very much looking forward to this program. I learned a lot. I'm wondering how, if this is for everyone, including Meredith, because this is the year of the 400th, how that helped. I came a little bit late, so I don't know if it was mentioned in the intro, how that helped to frame this program.
1619 to 2019. No slavery in America.
This actually, for us, is mildly coincidental. This is something that we've been trying to work on for a couple of years. And then also the timing of us getting a grant and all of that. So I wish I could say that, you know, I had this whole plan 10 years ago, but I would be lying. The timing is great, obviously, but it's also a little coincidental because we just never know when we, you know, put in a grant if it's going to be funded or not. So, not completely.
And I would just say, I've been working on this subject for 20 years. And it's now become popular and I'm thrilled, you know, that people are looking at it. But my very first job in the museum field was at the General Nicholas Herkimer home in Little Falls, New York. And General Nicholas Herkimer, who was hailed as the hero, as a revolutionary hero of New York, lived with his wife on the huge farm and had 33 slaves. So there were 33 slaves and two Germans. Every time I think about that, when I first started there, they never even mentioned these 33 people that made it possible for Nicholas Herkimer to have this enormous piece of property. And Lavati, this is another one for you, because
their hearth is so messed up.
But you can imagine the impact. You know, who's got what impact did they have? 33 people versus these two Europeans.
Yeah.
You know, they controlled this property. So where did they live? What did they eat? What did they, you know, they ran the farm for him. So, you know, there are a lot of us that have been doing this work for many, many years, and all of a sudden, it's finally caught on, and thank goodness. So.
But I also wanted to say, someone asked how it could support, it might have been just the unknown cemetery, but also, if I'm not mistaken, Dyckman Farmhouse is a 501c3, and we could all make anything we could afford in order to support this work.
And I didn't even hear to say that. So, everyone, I just wanted to thank you so much for coming. I want us to be good guests here at the library and not stay longer than I said we would, because they're going to get ready to close soon. So I would like to invite everyone here, and if there are other people that you want to invite to come with you, fabulous, back to the museum. I believe Peter will be joining us. Our panelists, I think, will be joining us for a little while, so we can continue to have this conversation. We'll be open until 6 o'clock tonight. And for hopefully everyone knows where the museum is, but 204 on Broadway, the house that looks older than everything else.